As Americans, we tend to pay the most attention to the films that are made domestically. We have made some of the greatest films of all time, but we aren't the only country with classics and masterpieces. Far from it. There is a world just outside that is so varied and unique that honestly we should be demanding to see more of it. There are filmmakers from all around with their own stories, visions, and ideas to share with us. Today, I want to talk about one of the most revered filmmakers of all time, a Spaniard by the name of Luis Buñuel. With many of his films ending up on esteemed lists for greatest films ever made, he is often called one of the greatest directors of all time. Films like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie and Belle de Jour have been cited by other big filmmakers as favorites of theirs. Viridiana won the Palme d'Or in 1961, and Un Chien Andalou is arguably one of the most famous live-action shorts of all time. However, there is one film of his in particular that I want to talk about that I believe to be his magnum opus. 1950's Los Olvidados, or as it's known in the US, The Young and the Damned. The film follows the story of a group of poverty-stricken adolescents trying to make it by in the streets of Mexico City. Things pick up when one of the older boys of the group, El Jaibo, kills another member of the group, Julian, after blaming him for getting locked up. Pedro, a friend of both Jaibo and Julian, is a witness to the murder and is pressured by Jaibo to keep it a secret. The rest of the film follows the hardships that Pedro has to endure to keep the secret while also trying to live a better life. But as we see throughout the film, life is not fair to people who were doomed the moment they were born.
¡Mamacita! ¿Dónde va? ¡Quieto! ¡Yo me quiero ir! ¡Yo no robé nada! ¡Mamacita! ¡Yo no robé nada! ¡Mamacita!
The film was controversial when it first premiered in Mexico, particularly with the government and upper-class citizens. Many critics at the time declared it to be vile and disrespectful. There was even an effort to get Buñuel's citizenship revoked, despite only a few years prior having denounced his own Spanish citizenship in favor of Mexico. But thankfully there came Octavio Paz to his aid, who fought hard for the film and even got it shown at the 1951 Cannes Film Festival. This brought a renewed interest in Buñuel as an international director after years of being out of the spotlight. With this newly found praise, the film got a second chance in Mexico and got the opposite reaction. It was now adored by the public and even years later is still considered one of the best films to come out of the country. But with all this praise thrown at the film, what do I like about it so much? I think the biggest reason would be its brutal yet honest depiction of inner-city children in poverty. Oftentimes we tend to gloss over the trickle-down effects of our economic and societal problems that affect our youngest members. But the film doesn't shy away from this at all. Buñuel went around various neighborhoods in Mexico City and studied how the people lived in those areas at the time. In fact, one particular story of a boy who was found dead in a garbage dump was what primarily influenced Buñuel to make the film. Despite being made at the height of Mexico's power as a film industry, the film itself stands out from many made at the time, primarily through its blending of the clashing neorealism and surrealism styles. While this is not the first Mexican film to incorporate either style, its usage of it certainly made a splash in an industry that at the time primarily made melodramas, musicals, and comedies, not unlike films made in the US around the same time. As a film cemented in the Italian neorealism style, it holds no punctures in its depiction of the real lives that these people would have lived in. There are no falsities here, only the bleak reality. This approach is more in common with Italian films at the time like Shoeshine. Directed by Vittorio De Sica, it has quite a bit in common with Los Olvidados, with a story about street kids who are punished by society for things that are out of their control. So I wouldn't be surprised if Buñuel was influenced by the film when deciding to do something so radically different from his usual style.
Non vedo l'ora di rivederlo.
A chi lo dici?
What also makes this film stand out is how Buñuel incorporates his French surrealist roots into a film that, on the surface, would be hindered by straying away from the reality it spent so much time depicting. To highlight what is my favorite scene in the whole film, I want to show how Buñuel managed to brilliantly fit the surreal into the real. In a dream sequence that follows Pedro, we are able to clearly see into his mind in ways we couldn't if Buñuel had strictly abided by neorealism. The guilt of harboring such a dark secret from the people he trusts, the jealousy and anger he feels towards Jaibo, and the abandonment and longing for affection from his mother. All these feelings are shown and explored throughout the film, but never quite as vividly or strongly as they are here. This isn't the only scene that plays with the surreal, but it's definitely the most prominent. But of course, Buñuel likes to subvert expectations and will throw a curveball at the audience when they least expect it. So don't think the strange and unusual can't find its way into the real world. This beautiful blend of styles is another reason why I love the film so much. It creates a unique feeling that very few films evoke, and with Pedro's dream in particular, striking straight into my core in ways I can't really explain. Another aspect I love about the film is the characters and how complex they are. On the surface, it's easy to write them off. Jaibo is the villain, the blind old man is a victim, Ojitos is an innocent, helpless child, Pedro's mother is careless and unsympathetic, etc., etc. But as the film progresses, it reveals so much more. These aren't just pawns in a story that's trying to elicit sympathy out of you. Jaibo may be cruel and relentless, but he's just another scared kid that, at his core, deeply cares about his mother. One could even argue if she was still around, he might have turned out differently. Don Carmelo, the blind old man, shows that he's just as mean and brutal as the homeless children he constantly berates, if not more so. Ojitos, the newcomer who recently got abandoned by his father, is shown early on to be polite and well-meaning, but even that begins to fade as he shows signs of violence that early on you wouldn't imagine. It's with this character that you see how the city and its people, who are raised in a society that doesn't care about them, have a way of influencing anyone caught in its current. In order to survive, violence and dishonesty is all many of these people know and see. And unfortunately, Ojitos isn't immune to this corruption of morale. Even Pedro's mother, in her own twisted way, shows by the end that she does indeed care for her son. She may blame him for her problems, but the guilt does eventually eat up at her as she feels at least somewhat bad for putting her son in this situation and seems to want to change things. These are interesting characters, and no matter how despicable some of them are, you can't help but feel at least a little bit sorry for them. Especially when you consider that all of them might have turned out differently if they weren't born into such a compromised life with no easy way out. Buñuel is not known for being a sentimental director. On the contrary, he almost always seems to take delight in making his characters suffer. And while the film is far from what you would call sentimental, I would argue he definitely shows care and even pity for his characters and the world they live in. Rather than playing God, he plays the bystander in a story where he can't do anything but watch as their lives fall apart due to the circumstances outside of Buñuel and the character's control. With all this praise I and others have thrown at the film, you might be wondering what else has it influenced. Well, its influence can definitely be found in other countries like Brazil with films like Biyote and City of God, which is also another personal favorite of mine. And even 50 years later in Mexico with Alejandro González Iñárritu's Amores Perros, all of which are films that deal with violent and poverty-stricken areas where the youth are most affected by this unjust system. Andrei Tarkovsky has cited before how Luis Buñuel was a big influence on his style, in particular how both prefer to look inward rather than outward. And while Los Olvidados, to my knowledge, hasn't been directly cited as an influence on Ivan's childhood, it's hard not to see the similarities, especially how it utilizes the surreal to delve into the character of Ivan in a dark and tragic way, not unlike Pedro. But what about the United States? Well, from what I've looked into, there doesn't seem to be any films that are explicitly influenced by Los Olvidados. As a matter of fact, there doesn't seem to be a ton of American films, period, that really go into the violent life of poverty without sugarcoating it or making the focus of the story about something else. A film like The Florida Project, I believe, does a great job showing how some kids are just dealt a bad hand in life. But even then, the film isn't quite as nihilistic as Los Olvidados. After all, the kids in the film live fairly happy lives despite their financial situation. They're not exactly sheltered, but they definitely seem a little bit naive or oblivious to what's really going on. Rather, it seems to show the beauty that can be found in life in spite of everything, which is the opposite message of Los Olvidados. There are also films like Larry Clark's Kids, which, while showing how violent and unforgiving adolescents can be, never really has much to say on the condition they live in. And when it does, it's more about how sex influences them rather than how economic burdens or societal pressure pushes them to the edge. The closest films I can think of being a descendant of Los Olvidados are films like Menace to Society and Boys in the Hood. Both, I believe, are far more in line with these grimmer depictions of adolescence and how people tend to be products of their environment. They both show how violent and unstable the everyday lives of people in these neighborhoods can be, how poorly society often treats them, and how life itself has a way of dragging everyone down, no matter how hard they try to escape. Boys in the Hood, like Los Olvidados, also made a similarly big splash when it first came out for exposing middle and upper class America to a side of their cities that they were either oblivious to or didn't care about. The difference, however, being that Boys in the Hood does leave us with a shred of optimism for the main character of Trey. It's not a happy ending, but it's not totally hopeless either. Menace to Society, on the other hand, ends on just as bleak and negative of an ending as Los Olvidados. And while neither film from what I've read is directly influenced by Los Olvidados, you can definitely make a case that both, especially Menace to Society, are the closest we've gotten to a film that really shows how miserable and violent a life of poverty is in America.
Either they don't know, don't show, or don't care about what's going on in the hood.
The term Hollywood ending can be traced back to the golden age of Hollywood films, where the studio system reigned supreme and the Hays Code more or less censored films that could be considered morally problematic. And while we have definitely gotten some real downer endings in American films later on, it did take a while for this to catch on in Hollywood at least. Los Olvidados is a cold and unrelentless film with a surprisingly dark ending. Not exactly the kind of stuff Hollywood was making at the time. And even though the neo-realist films Italians were making at the time were pretty somber and depressing at times, they always had a shred of optimism. It's not a film that was meant for the faint of heart, and even now seems to make people new to the film feel the same kind of hopelessness and despair it did back then. I also would argue that the film being so radically different from Luis Buñuel's other works is also a big part of why it's not nearly as talked about both in the US and elsewhere. It's a neo-realist film that pities its child characters from a director best known for taking pleasure in torturing his characters, who also tended to be adults, not kids. A director who loves his surrealist style and using it to make fun of the bourgeoisie lifestyle and religion. The same man who loves his dark animal imagery, as well as highlighting the absurdity of sexuality and lust. And while the film has elements of all of these to an extent, it's not playing it off in a laughing matter like he normally does. It's also not as surreal as his early films, nor as safe and sterile as the films he would later make in France. It has more in common with the films he made in Mexico, with many of them having an attitude and an edge that he would seem to lose later on in his career. In fact, those films made during his time in Mexico are not as discussed, period. Sure, some are held in high regard, but not quite to the extent of his earlier works or the stuff he did later on. Buñuel is a fairly divisive figure, all things considered, for the various things I mentioned his films tend to contain. They're definitely not for everyone, and I absolutely get why some may outright hate the man in his films, but if you haven't seen Los Olvidados, I highly recommend you give it a watch before you write the man off. His early works may be overkill for some, and his quote-unquote golden age later on might be too stuffy and repetitive for others, but I guarantee you, Los Olvidados is unlike anything you've seen from Luis Buñuel.
Uno menos. Uno menos. Así irán cayendo todos. Ojalá los mataran a todos antes de nacer.